Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to a Reagan Forum, hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. The Center for Public Affairs offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. In his first inaugural address, as he looked out over the National Mall, President Reagan declared, "Above all, we must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have." They are words that defined his foreign policy. They are words that defined his presidency. They are the words that were shaped by Ken Khachigian, Ronald Reagan's chief speechwriter. Less than 2 weeks ago on July 30th, 2024, the Reagan Foundation hosted an in-person event with Ken to discuss his latest book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. It's a book that Fox Business Network's Larry Kudlow called essential reading for anyone wanting to know how Ronald Reagan shaped his crusading message of economic growth through tax cuts and limited government. Behind Closed Doors is a compelling insider's account by the trusted advisor and confidant to America's presidential giants and political legends. In the book, Ken Khachigian draws the curtains back to provide today's only hands-on narrative of his most private, historic moments with Presidents Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon during revolutionary changes in our economy, politics, communications, foreign policy, and culture. During the program, Ken sat down in conversation with Reagan Foundation and Institute President and CEO David Trulio to share these stories and more. Let's listen.
Wow. So, Ken, tell us about yourself. You grew up where and how did you end up in the Nixon campaign and Nixon White House? Give us a little bit of context.
Small town Visalia, California. Went to UCSB. Go Gauchos. Any Gauchos in the audience? And decided after graduating from UCSB, I was first admitted to Bolt Hall, but then got an opportunity to go to Columbia Law School, where you went. And I was a political junkie. Actually, I met Richard Nixon at UCSB and read Six Crises, so I was interested in him there. By the way, I don't know if I even told you this. I met President Reagan at UCSB. He came in 1966 when he was campaigning for governor, and I was student body president. And I got to introduce all the luminaries that came to UCSB. And I introduced Ronald Reagan to the campus. And I still have the introduction somewhere in my files. I'll have to donate it to the library one of these days. And so when I was at Columbia, I was bored with law school and interested in politics, and I saw an article in the newspaper that Nixon was going to run for president again, and he wasn't exactly, this was late 1967, and people weren't clamoring around Nixon back in the late 60s because he had already been a two-time loser. And the leading candidates were Nelson Rockefeller and George Romney and Ronald Reagan. And Nixon was thought to be a loser at that time. But I thought this might be an opportunity for me to get involved in a campaign. And there was an article in the New York Times by Bob Semple about people assembling around him to run a campaign. And he had a little office up on Fifth Avenue. So I decided to write a letter to him at his law office, 20 Broad Street at the Nixon Mudge Law Office. And I wrote that letter, and I never got a response back, which I thought was a little rude. So I called his office, and I said, I wrote a letter to Mr. Nixon, and I never got an answer back. And they said, well, maybe it got lost in the mail. Why don't you send it back? And I had kept a carbon copy. Well, kids don't know what carbon copies are anymore. So I had a carbon copy, and I had to type it, and the kids don't know what typewriters they are either. So I had a Royal typewriter, so I retyped it. and I put it in a sealed envelope, and I gave it to a special courier, my wife, Meredith. She worked at 30 Wall Street, which is just around the corner, about 2 blocks away, 2.5 blocks away from 20 Broad Street, which is where Nixon's office was. And she carried it and gave it to a receptionist. And about 2.5 weeks later, I got a letter back from Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan was an aide to Mr. Nixon. And Pat said, "Why don't you come on in for an interview?"
Well, one of the sub-themes in your book is the role of chance or luck in this, right? So is it conceivable that if you hadn't been in law school in New York, you might not have thought to volunteer for this campaign? If Meredith hadn't been working a couple blocks away, maybe you wouldn't have volunteered to walk the letter in, and the whole course of your life might have been different.
Exactly. If I was at Bolt Hall, I would have had a whole different trajectory in my life, yeah. I would have never ended up where I am.
So let's fast forward a bit. What do you end up doing for Richard Nixon, and what was your relationship with him before, basically up until Watergate? What was your relationship?
Okay, so in that campaign, I answered correspondence. I did all the scut work that you do, and young people need to understand you don't start at the top. You do scut work, you answer correspondence. And
by the way, you're a Columbia law student.
I'm a second-year law student.
So your family's probably not thrilled that they're you're supposed to go be a lawyer, and instead you're dealing with campaign correspondence.
Yeah.
Right?
Right after my law classes, I took that 104 bus or 105 bus down Broadway up to Fifth Street and volunteered. And every time I had a chance, I'd do some research, and I'd hand it over to Marty Anderson, who was volunteering from Hoover, or I'd give it to someone else. And anyway, Marty Anderson saw that I was eager, and he said, "Why don't you work for us? We're going to win the nomination." So I got a job in the summer, worked for Alan Greenspan, who was head of domestic policy research. And that led to my getting a job after I passed the bar in California. I got a job at the White House in 1970. And then spent the next 4 years working in the White House, first with Herb Klein, who was head of communications, and then briefly for Chuck Colson, but then transitioned into working with Pat Buchanan from 1971 until through the campaign, and then on the speechwriting staff, and then all through up until 74.
So your story is like, up until this point, like many stories of people who serve in presidential administrations. You were a kid from Visalia, an agricultural community.
Right.
You weren't connected to the East Coast power elite or to Washington or anything. You were essentially a volunteer. You were persistent, and this world of opportunity opens up to you.
Right.
And you developed a nickname called Onoda. and I think it might be revealing to help people understand, why were you called Onoda, and what is the background of that nickname?
Well, Hiro Onoda was a Japanese soldier who stayed in the jungles until 1970 because he refused to believe that the war was over, and he wasn't going to surrender until the emperor told him to surrender. And my nickname became Onoda in the Nixon White House because I refused to believe that Nixon should resign from office. And I was one of the only few remaining people who didn't want him to resign. And I didn't want him to give up. I didn't want him to surrender the office. So I got the nickname Onoda.
So you were prepared to be in the jungle for 30 years. Okay, got it. So in your book opens, or fairly early in your book, you talk about the end game during Watergate. Where were you in the last 6 months prior to President Nixon resigning?
Well, I was on the speechwriting staff, but the last 6 months we were, even though I was on the speechwriting staff, the last 6 months we were pretty much going into the impeachment battle, and I was wearing that hat all the way through and getting prepared for impeachment and fighting the impeachment wars.
So fast forward, President Nixon resigns, and you follow him to what Hugh Hewitt calls the Elba of America, which is San Clemente, California.
Right.
Okay, so what was that like? Who asked you, hey, you want to come to San Clemente with this president who just resigned?
Well, I was in the White House, and I got calls from Ron Ziegler and Diane Sawyer was there, and they said, "Look, we're desperate. We need some help." And so after about 2 weeks.
By the way, I didn't know this, but Diane Sawyer was a key Nixon aide.
That's right.
I mean, many of us got to know her in her prominent roles as a TV journalist, an extremely accomplished one. But there she was with you working with President Nixon.
She was just about 27 years old. I don't know, maybe 25. And she was a staff aide to Ron Ziegler. And she was very helpful. She and I worked together very closely during the impeachment. We worked on a couple of key white papers together. And so she went out to San Clemente, and they called, and they said, "We need some help." And I'd never worked one-on-one with the president, but I did have some background as a lawyer, and they were still subpoenaing him. They were trying to destroy him. They had back taxes. He didn't have an income.
Was that maybe the first indication of what today is called lawfare, or is that, do you see close similarities?
I think the lawfare was more like during the whole Watergate prosecution, because, and that's a whole nother story that I don't think you have time to get into, but.
So you're now in the trenches, but working directly with former president.
Yeah, I'm trying to help him get out of this morass of back taxes that he had to pay, and help him get his squared away in his new offices, to get a budget going.
And how many of you were there in his immediate world?
Well, in that immediate world right then, there was just about 5 or 6 of us, and then I had to return back to Washington.
But it's worth noting, he was a very young vice president. He becomes president of the United States, gets reelected in a landslide, and then it's him and 5 staffers and a mountain of legal and financial problems.
That's right. And nobody else to help out, exactly. And the entire world's still trying to destroy him. And he took me aside at that time, and here the world had come crashing down on him, and everything he had dreamed of his whole life that he wanted had been taken away. And I was despondent. I was 29 years old. I had my whole world in front of me, but I was despondent. And he took me aside and he said, "Ken," he said, don't get down. You've got to look forward. We can't let this get down on us." And I thought, oh my gosh, here everything had been taken away from him, and he was still positive. He was looking forward. He was
giving you a pep talk.
He was giving me a pep talk, and trying to, but he said, right then, he was already trying to remake his life.
So in the book, you say, so now you start working closely with him. You collaborate with him on his projects, and you say, on page 26, "My dialogues with Nixon and San Clemente would prove indispensable to the success of my relationship with Ronald Reagan."
Absolutely.
Tell us about that. What is this path that this relationship takes you down?
What's interesting is I started to write this book about Ronald Reagan only. I don't think I told you this. And because I had a very senior position with President Reagan, and so I was going to write a memoir only about President Reagan. But after only writing a few pages of this, I realized that I got my doctor's degree at the University of Reagan, but I got my bachelor and master's degree at the College of Richard Nixon. And all the things that I'd learned under Richard Nixon, I applied to Ronald Reagan, all the communicating skills, all the political skills that I applied to help Reagan win in 1980, and then later in collaborating with him. A lot of these skills I picked up working for Richard Nixon and learning sitting at his knee for hours and hours and hours and hours as he gave me all these strategic skills, all this background that he had from 40s and 50s and 60s as a brilliant political strategist.
Fascinating, and it's worth noting that people of great influence in presidential administrations very, very frequently served in prior administrations of the same party,
right.
and you fell very much in that tradition.
When we were in the 80 campaign, we were mired. He was when I got on board, he was mired in getting these long speeches from the headquarters that were 20 minutes and 30 minutes long, and nothing was working. And the point is that, like Nixon said, you got to do speech inserts. Forget these long speeches. The press only wants
sound bites.
Sound bites.
Yeah.
And so that's and I knew that from working with Nixon in the White House, and I knew it from him, and that was his precise advice when I got into the campaign. Give him sound bites.
So let's talk about the craft and the challenges of being a speechwriter. First of all, there was no email, there was no Google, right? So any of us can go over to Air Force One here at the Reagan Library and see the IBM correcting Selectric typewriter that Ken used on the plane, and that was probably the more modern version. You'd probably use earlier versions. So literally, basic research becomes quite an undertaking. You can't Google it. You spend a lot of time faxing speeches back and forth.
That's right.
At one point in the book, you say it's actually better to have less time than more time to write a speech. But crucially, you're getting inputs from all over. So tell us about that. What was that like?
Well, the plane would land and we'd fight over the connecting up the.
And this is a 1980 campaign.
1980.
So you're on the plane with Ronald Reagan,
Right.
Stu Spencer, and a select group.
Yeah, and there's no connection from the air with anything. There's no connection with the campaign or anything. So if you want any research, you had to carry it with you. Whenever you landed that you got from the headquarters. And if you needed something new, you had to fight. The minute you landed, you had to fight to get a landline plugged in, and there were only 2 or 3 landlines. So you fought with everybody else to get a landline to connect up with the headquarters to get a piece of information, or you had to fight for the fax machine. And kids barely know what fax machines are. And back in '68, we had what we called Twixes, which were telegraph machines, basically. So it was very difficult. And my briefcase got fatter and fatter and fatter as I went because I had to collect all this stuff and keep it with me.
So you had your own research with you.
I had my research with me throughout.
Right. And you're getting bombarded with inputs from different people. And one of the other themes in your book is that apparently everybody thinks they're good at speechwriting.
That's right. Everybody's a speechwriter until they have to write the first word.
Right.
They all love to be speechwriters when they have your draft, and then they get, oh, geez, I like to edit this thing.
Well, and tell us about vision, because vision comes up a lot, right?
Yeah, that's right. They'll get your speech in their hand and they'll say, oh, there's not enough vision in here. And then you say, well, what do you mean by vision? Well, they can't exactly tell you what vision is. But believe me, it's very frustrating to have people looking over your shoulder writing
So
speeches.
would you say, is it easier to be a speechwriter now than it was for you back in the day?
I don't think it's ever easy being a speechwriter, especially if you have people looking over your shoulder. It's easier now. If anybody asks me to give a speech, I'll say, yeah, give me $50,000 and don't have anybody looking over my shoulder, and I'll write your speech. But I've turned down some important people. I turned down Elton John to write a speech. And to this day, I can't remember why I turned him down, but I turned him down. That's one I should have.
But if he were to call you, the price is $50,000. Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit. The book, in great detail, illustrates the battle within presidential staff to influence policy.
Right.
Policy, of course, and messaging. And in the book, apparently there's a disease going around in Washington. And it's, at one point you call it a natural disease in the White House with individuals who rise to the top. Later you call it the disease of proximity to the Oval Office. Another way you put it is power, the lethal drug, power aphrodisiac. So tell us about these elements and how you saw it come into force.
Yeah, people who are somewhat normal people, all of a sudden they get in close to the Oval Office, and they have access to the White House. They have access to the White House operators, and they have access to 10 steps from talking to the president, and they have this feeling that they all of a sudden their head gets enlarged, and they have this ultimate power on their head, and that they want to wield this power, and it just becomes enormous, and that you can't touch them, and they become arrogant. And and people who are normal people, they become bullies. They want to impose themselves on you. They want to impose policy upon the president. And it just becomes an enormous distraction on administration policies. And I found this very difficult to deal with when I was there.
Given that dynamic, which is somewhat enduring. This is not specific to your time in the Nixon Reagan years. What is your advice to the next president who will have to staff a White House, will have to staff a cabinet? What should the next president look for to take into account for that persistent pitfall?
Well, you have to let people know that, first of all, the president makes policy. And people that come in have to understand that it's not their job. They're not there to wield power. They're there to implement the president's policies. They're there, if the president has a mission, when the president gets elected, the president has there to implement policies that he or she wants to put into whatever the crusade that they bring into. In Reagan's case, he had a crusade, and he wanted to implement that, and he had a revolution. And so whatever the president does, when they come into power, they need to impose upon their staff that that's my policy, and you're here to implement it. You're not here to tell me what to do. You're here to give me ideas. You're here to give me suggestions. You're here to try to help me, but you're not here to tell me what to do. And I want to make that very clear from the outset. And I always I'm not looking for yes men or yes women or anything else, but I just want to make it clear. But the other thing is, the other problem are leaks. And the leaks are a real disease in every White House and every administration. And the leaks are by people who want to make themselves look self-important. And when they do leaks, they do it to embellish their own personalities and embellish their own positions. And that's another aspect of their increasing their sense of power, especially in Washington.
One of the enormously interesting aspects of your book is how reflective you are and how candid you are about your experiences. I'd like to extrapolate. What are some advice that you would have for, I asked about the advice to the president, but advice to future White House staff and other senior staff. And the question is rooted in the fact that in at least 3 places you talk about your regrets, your regrets in your time in the White House. So what advice would you give to somebody who's going in to serve a future president?
Well, there were occasions when I held back on giving advice to the president when I thought that his policies were not being well served by people on his staff. There were occasions when he talked to me about his own crusade very many times, and there were occasions where I thought that the policies that were there to implement the crusade that he was going to put into place were not being, his mission was not being implemented. And that I had an opportunity to say to him, Mr. President, I think that you're being misled, and I could have had an opportunity to point that out, and I didn't. And I held back because I wanted go along to get along, and I shouldn't have done that. Now, having said that, I don't think people, especially in my position as a speechwriter, I never tried to impose my views on the president. I never tried to sneak anything into a speech to try to change his policies. I don't mean it by that. But I think if you have if people have a chance to tell a president that he's being misled or he's being manipulated by his staff, that they should step up to it and tell them. I think that's true of any situation with any CEO, by the way, but especially for a president if they're being misled on a direction of a policy that's very critical.
And by extrapolation, you have to have the courage of your convictions and be prepared for the blowback that might come.
Yeah.
In another place in the book, you actually talk about regretting holding back with the president himself. You said, one of my deepest regrets while serving Reagan is that I did not forcefully disagree with him on his 1982 tax increase.
Right.
So it's one thing to disagree with the staff, but tell us, I mean, it must have, I'm sure you thought about that sentence very carefully when you wrote it. How did you look back on your regret with respect to the president himself?
Well, that was a decision that he made, that he reversed himself, that he himself talked about that he didn't want to reverse himself because he talked about, you'll read in the book, he talked about Maggie Thatcher making her own reversal on tax policies, and then he thought that was wrong. And then he came to the point where he was going to be faced with raising taxes, and many on his staff were shoving him in that direction, and I felt that was the wrong decision, and he wanted support for the decision he was going to make. But what happened, that he had been misled by Congress, and some on his staff had supported that position, that he was going to get $1. If he had raised $1 in taxes, he was going to get $3 in budget cuts by Congress, and that turned out not to be true. That was actually a lie, and he was misled on that, and I knew he was being misled, and I should have stepped up to and told him that, and been more forceful in that, and I really regretted that. And later on in the presidency, at the end of the presidency in 1988, when we worked on his 1988 convention speech, he was very bitter about that. He said, I was lied to, I was misled, and that was the worst. He said that was the worst mistake of my presidency on domestic issues.
You've used the word crusader a few times, and that's a very significant word. In fact, you quote President Reagan in 1981 at Camp David, and he's saying to you, and you're quoting him, Ken, we've gotten away from the effective things we talked about in the campaign. We need to get back to being crusaders, to show how hard we're working to get government out of the lives and to help government out of our lives and to help blue-collar workers not be taxed to death. It's hard to bring this about, but we have to make an emotional appeal to counter the other side. Tell us about the crusader and the emotional appeal, something that I would suggest a lot of Republicans are not very good at. But what were your thoughts on that?
There are two things about that. One is that I think he was telling me, I think he was sort of, I was being his therapist a little bit that day. I think he was worried that his staff was not fulfilling the part of that crusade that he was carrying out and that he wanted to carry out in his 1980 campaign, and which was very, very important to him. And the other thing was when he said about the emotional side, that was another story about Mrs. Reagan's contribution to his communication. And that was something she told me in 1980 when we were campaigning through Illinois, and we were riding in a limousine together.
To a hog farm.
To a hog farm, yeah. Through these dusty cornfields and riding out, must have been 2 or 3 hours, I think. And they had me crowded. She was sitting behind me, and I was bumped up against the driver, and we were riding for hours. And she said one thing about Ronnie that on his speeches, Ken, you have to remember he has to be emotional, and so that was a memory I had that was reinforced by him in that meeting at Camp David in June of 1981, and I think that what he really wanted me to do was to pass that along to his staff. Sometimes he was not fearful, that he liked to avoid confrontation, and that he would have liked to have said that to his staff himself, but didn't.
More from a Reagan Forum featuring Ken Khachigian after this message.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now back to a Reagan Forum featuring Ken Khachigian.
Well, you mentioned Mrs. Reagan, and it's been said many times, one cannot fully understand Ronald Reagan or his presidency without understanding the significant role that Nancy Reagan played. You, in the book, recount a story involving Richard Nixon, where following Ronald and Nancy Reagan's appearance at the Republican National Convention in 1976, where Gerald Ford defeated Ronald Reagan, Nixon commented on both Ronald and Nancy Reagan, describing them as classy, right? And then you recount Nixon saying earlier that he said about Nancy Reagan, she's the toughest of the bunch, reflecting the various people around Ronald Reagan's orbit. So here's this tough lady who was, by many, I think, very unfairly derided as just looking up to her husband and so on. But tell us, what was your impression of Nancy Reagan? And also, if you could elaborate more about what was Richard Nixon's impression of Nancy Reagan?
Well, when he perceived her as the toughest of the lot, he meant that as a compliment.
Right.
That she played a very strong role in Ronald in his galaxy, and I found this out very quickly in the 1980 campaign when things were not going really all that well, swimmingly. In 1980, it started going much better when Mrs. Reagan joined us, and I refer to her as the unofficial chief of staff of the campaign. I found this out the hard way, by the way, when I was a little slow in getting a speech to the president. It really wasn't my fault. It was just that we had to change we had a great line, and we wanted to add it to the speech, and it was not easy writing a speech, and we had to write the speech, we had to redo it, the secretaries had to type it, and if there was mistakes, they had to white out and dry it up using the air conditioning on the plane to dry out the white out. But it was going really slow, and Mrs. Reagan walked to the back of the plane, and she wasn't very happy. And so I found out very quickly what it meant for her to be the chief of staff. But anyway, but she helped us run a tighter ship. But that was a good role for her in terms of her having a role to help the trains run on time and help him in a very supportive way and give him a lot of self-confidence in that 1980 campaign that he needed very definitely.
So let's go back to Richard Nixon and let's talk about his relationship with Ronald Reagan. So how did it grow from the moment Ronald Reagan is elected and beyond? And you were something of a very unique person in that you had a relationship with both men. And the book recounts how you're getting memos, you're getting phone calls from Richard Nixon. How did you juggle that?
Well, it was important. That's one of the important things in the book is that I had a secret relationship with former President Nixon, that where I got memos from him to deliver to President Reagan to give him advice in the campaign. And then he would also phone me on the campaign trail to pass along advice. And so there are two memos that have never been surfaced before that are in the appendix of the book where President Nixon gave advice to President Reagan. And I juggled that because if it was not that long after Watergate, and we didn't want it to get public, so it had to be very, very carefully done. And so I did it through one was through a very secret contact I had with former President Nixon's chief of staff, where I did it through a secret meeting where he had a code name, Mr. Hudson, and we did it 2 blocks from our campaign stop, and it was like out of a John le Carré novel. And the other times I did it were through these secret phone calls that I'd pass the information on to Stu Spencer. So it was a good relationship, and that thread of Nixon helping Reagan through the campaign is a very important one in the.
And how were the insights? How was the advice received?
I think it was very important because I think it buttressed Reagan. It's not like it was absolutely critical, but what the advice was throughout the campaign was how important the economy was as an issue in the campaign. You know, I watched James Carville on TV talking. Everybody refers to him as with this quote about it's the economy, stupid, and everybody thinks Carville came up with this. And I think James Carville is a genius, mainly because he got Mary Madeline to marry him. But Richard Nixon in 1980, there are dozens of times in this book where he's advising Ronald Reagan about how critical the economy is. It's not foreign policy in 1980, it's the economy, it's the economy, it's the economy. And so he kept us focused on inflation and the economy. That was very important.
You mentioned the appendix of your book. It's sort of a feast of memos. Many of them people haven't seen or really been exposed to. But what's also clear from your book is if you had tried to write this book 20 years ago, you actually wouldn't have been able to do it. So tell us about, it illustrated for me how to fully understand a presidency, it actually requires the passage of time because all of this new insight surfaces. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, a lot of history, passage of time gives you more perception. And it allows you to see what's happened over the years, and also allows you to see what everybody else has written over the years. But the passage of time tells you what happened, what has happened in the economy, what changes took place, the history that took place after President Reagan took office, the downfall of the Cold War, what happened in the Bush's presidency, and all this gives you more perception and a depth of understanding that you wouldn't have. I wouldn't have had any of this background if I had written this book in 1988 or 89 or 90, without the ability to read more of the background of what my colleagues had written or the background of
when you quote President Reagan's diaries at various points,
well,
those were not even available until the late 2000s.
Or the biographies about President Reagan, or Lou Cannon's biographies, or Edmund Morris' biographies. But the diaries have been critical. President Reagan's diaries have been critical in helping me as a guidepost through this book.
Yeah, I want to touch on one of the most well-known phrases of Ronald Reagan's career, and I'll do that in the form of a question, and that is, are you really better off than you were in 1976? So tell us about, are you really better off than you were in 1976 in Langhorne, Pennsylvania? What was going on there?
That's right. That was early in October. We were campaigning in Langhorne, Pennsylvania at the Oxford Mall, and somehow these lines just spring into your head, and I came up with it as an insert in his stump speech, and it was, ask yourself, are you better off today than you were in 1976? And that was the beginning of the line that morphed into, we changed it a little bit over the next few days and weeks, and he used it again a couple of more times in LA, and he changed it to ask yourself, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So, but the genesis of that was in that Oxford Mall in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. And then the key thing is, he used it in the debate with Jimmy Carter at the end of October in 1980, and there's an interesting element to that story. Both President Nixon and I didn't think that Reagan did all that well in that debate.
In 80?
In 80.
Yeah.
Yet,
there was only one debate in 80, by the way.
Only one debate. But that line was definitive in that debate. But I would add one more thing, and you have this speech available at the website at the library, and that's the 30-minute speech he gave at the end of the campaign on the economy, and that 30-minute speech was originally only about 24 minutes long, and so I was brought in to. I didn't write the original speech; I was brought in to add to it. So I did a very elongated version of Are You Better Off Than You Were 4 years ago by adding all different elements to it. So you may want to watch that speech if you get a chance.
So basically, Are You Better Off Than You Were 4 years ago ties back to Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and you. And you didn't even remember that, actually. You told me.
That's right. When I did my oral history at the University of Virginia, they asked me, do you remember who came up with that line? And I said, geez, I don't even remember that. And then when I was researching for this book, I've got huge file cabinets in my office, and I'd kept all the speech inserts that I'd done during the campaign, and I was going through them, and I found this one from Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and I said, oh my gosh. There it is. There's that one I wrote at the Oxford Mall, and I was the author of it. So I lied to in my oral history.
So let's fast forward to 1990. Ronald Reagan is out of office for about a year, and it's probably where this photo was taken.
Right.
Right. So you and our chairman, now chairman Fred Ryan, and one other staffer were in the room. Mm-hmm. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, now two post-presidents, get together. Let's explore what that was like, and let's also explore, on the surface, there's some fascinating similarities, right? They were both Californians. They both grew up under very humble circumstances, but in the book you described that they came from two disparate cultural galaxies. So what were the differences between these two men, and then what did you talk about in this or what was spoken about in this meeting with these two giants?
Well, the meeting started off. President Nixon was going to open his library in July 1990, and he asked, he would like to pay a courtesy call on President Reagan. So he asked me to accompany him. Of course, I wasn't going to turn him down. And so we met in Century City, and it was I can't remember, it was about 38 minutes, 40-minute long meeting. And it was, it's the last chapter of the book, and I call it The Lions Gather. So I took really close notes. And the meeting started off sort of awkward. They didn't have a lot in common. Nixon's idea of serious thought was talking about politics and foreign policy and things like that. And Reagan's idea of that meeting was talking about the Annenberg saddle they had and other things. So they didn't have a lot of common right away, and so the meeting didn't start off really well. So I broke the ice by saying, "How did the two of you meet?" I thought that might get it going, and because I didn't know how they met, and Nixon said, "I remember you came and testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee." It was probably 1947 when Reagan headed up the Screen Actors Guild, trying to get the communists out of the Union. And that broke the ice, and then they started going on. And before long, they started talking about Gorbachev and the Soviet Union and back and forth. And then it got really interesting. They started talking about international affairs, and then you really got the notion of, then it became a real historical meeting, because you really saw these were the two political giants and legends that ended the Cold War. The men that were that stood astride the end of the quarter century, last quarter of the century, the 20th century, and it would be like sitting in on meeting between FDR and Truman or something like that. The history of it, and it was just very fascinating.
But it was a short meeting, right? And President Nixon, of course, came to the opening of the Reagan Library the next year.
Right.
But they didn't really keep in any kind of close touch or have a personal relationship, right? It was all kind of business.
Right.
Yeah, great. Well, in a moment, we're going to go to questions. So please make sure you have your questions ready. We have a few folks with microphones. A reminder that questions end with question marks. So we'll go to that in just a moment. But maybe, Ken, in 45 seconds or less, what does Ronald Reagan mean to you?
Well, he brought a lot of sunshine into my life throughout those 8 years. Every time I saw him, he was just a lot of warmth, and he was gracious. Every picture I have in my wall that he signed, it was something really warm and nice. And every time if I talk to him on the phone, I describe it as sunshine coming over the phone line. And he just made a difference. Every time he told a story, there was a lot of fun to it. Every time you saw him, I describe him a lot of times in the book. The way he dressed, it looked like he'd come off of a movie set, or if he wore some old sport coat or something, it looked like he could light up a Lucky Strike out of a 1940s movie or something. Or if he told a funny story, it would just light up your life. So it was always just fun to be around him. But also, what was great was how he changed America, and it made you feel better that you had something to do, that you were a part of something just larger than your own life.
Did you have a sense of how significant his presidency was as it was unfolding? Did you understand the momentous nature of the Reagan years while you were a practitioner in there, or were you heads down, managing?
You're so busy.
Right.
When you're there working on things, sometimes you're so tired, you're so worn out, you're not sure. But that's where the 25, 30-year perspective comes into play, and you finally see, looking back, and you see, I know I'm not supposed to, you see what other presidents do that aren't quite up to the task of what President Reagan did. You can see how, with the passage of time, how critically important it was, and how different his leadership was.
Okay, let's open it up. Who would like to start? I think we have a question way over here on the end. Yeah, Let's just wait for the microphone.
All right. During your 8 years, what was the most difficult and emotional time that Ronald Reagan went through during the period you were with him?
The most difficult emotional time?
Yeah, the most difficult emotionally for him, based on not his personal life, but more into his politics and things that happened around the world at that time.
So when was, over the course of your exposure to President Reagan, what kind of challenges did he face, or what periods in his presidency were the most difficult for him?
Oh, okay. The most difficult single time was in 1985, was his first personal crisis, was called the Bitburg crisis, when he was supposed to go to Europe to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II. And his advancement, he was to lay a wreath at the cemetery of some German soldiers along with Chancellor Kohl. And the advancement, when they went to Germany to advance this, the cemetery was covered with snow. And in the spring, when the snow melted, they found out that the cemetery site was covered up the site of German Waffen SS Nazis. And so the big firestorm erupted back home in Congress and in the press and the media and among the Jewish community especially as well, saying you can't go, that you'd be seen as an anti-Semite, you can't honor these Nazi soldiers, and it's hard for me to describe the firestorm. It was the lowest moment in his presidency up to that time. He was being attacked from every corner, including from Nancy, who didn't want him to go. They were arguing. Mike Deaver talks about it as the worst argument he's ever seen them have. And I was not in the White House at that time, but I was in private sector, but they called on me to come help write a speech to be delivered at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany to help atone for this. So I came in from California and sat down with him. And so the reason I bring this up is this was the lowest personal moment in his presidency at that time. He was, and he talks about it in his diary, and it was the first time I'd seen him when I walked into the Oval Office where he didn't have this big smile on his face. He was low and down in despair. And that, and then the next time again was during Iran-Contra when he was in the same situation. Those were the two times when he was having difficulties.
And for further context, the reason, notwithstanding all the advice and urging that he not go through with the wreath laying, the reason he carried it forward with that had to do with his commitment to Chancellor Kohl, right? Can you elaborate on that?
That's right. He made a personal commitment to Chancellor Kohl that he was going to follow through on this commemoration ceremony. And it was very important also for foreign policy reasons and defense reasons. We had Pershing missiles stationed in Germany, and he also had to do it. And by the way, President Nixon sent him a very secret confidential memo saying that giving him, President Reagan, the confidence that he had to follow through on this. And so at the end of the day, he followed through, gave a very successful speech. Edmund Morris called it the greatest speech of his presidency. I don't know if that's true or not.
This is the Bergen-Belsen.
Bergen-Belsen.
Right, so he did speak at a former concentration camp.
Yes.
Essentially on the same day or in the same trip as he went to Bitburg, the cemetery.
He spoke on May 5th, in 1985, and the result was, it was the only time President Reagan called me after a speech. And he called me a few days later, and he had a big smile on his. I could see the smile coming over the phone line. And he said, he ended the phone call by saying, Chancellor Kohl was so happy, and then he said, "I think I could have been elected president of Germany."
Next question. We've got one right in the back there.
Hey, thank you very much. Fascinating conversation. I kind of have two questions for you. The first one, what is the speech writing process like? Does Reagan come up with the ideas and tell you, I want to communicate this message and include these points? Or do you how does the process work? That's one question. And then the other question is, Reagan is also known for his humor. Do you guys sit around and tell jokes? Where does the humor come from? How do you draw out the humor? How do you incorporate it?
If it's a really big, important speech, the president would, we'd have two ways of doing this. He'd have his own thoughts when we'd sit down, and I'd have my thoughts that I'd share with him. But if it was like the inaugural address, he came in with his own thoughts at the front end. And then I had a big stack of my own notes as well. That speech at Bergen-Belsen, he was so distraught. He had opening phrases and thoughts of his own to begin with. But a lot of times, he didn't have time to work on a speech or that's why I had speechwriters around. So I would go in, give him a lot of ideas and thoughts, and he would give me feedback, and then we'd give him a draft. But he loved to write speeches. And so if he had time, he worked on them himself a lot. So if it was the big speeches at the early part of the administration, the economic speeches, he spent a lot of time editing and rewriting. The inaugural address he rewrote hugely. So the first big speeches he rewrote and edited heavily because he loved to write. So that's how he did that. But if they were just speeches that were commemorative speeches, small audiences that were not all that important, a lot of times he would just rely on his speech writing staff to give him drafts, and he would lightly edit. As for the humor, he had such a stack of his own jokes that we didn't need to fiddle with it. But I'll give away a secret. In the 1984 campaign, we did hire a gag writer. We had Bob Hope's gag writer we hired because we had so many places that we went to.
That's actually in the book.
That's actually in the book, yeah. So like, we were dealing with, we had a pollster that was always fussing about the so-called age issue, which was not really an issue. But so he went to Old Heidelberg Park in Milwaukee. And so this writer put in a line for Reagan and say, gee, I can remember when they just called it Heidelberg Park. And so we had lines like that, and just a bunch of them, but this writer helped us with that. But people asked me about that line in the second debate with Mondale, where he said about he wouldn't use age against Mondale. That was all Reagan. It came out of his head. He had no writers for that one.
Yeah. Got time for one more question, right here on the aisle.
Question, thank you for your patriotism and serving under both presidents.
It was an honor, yeah. Real honor.
Kind of a sore subject with the Iranian hostage crisis. I know you had some influence with the speech on that. Did the CIA help, brief the president? You don't have to answer that second question. That's a joke. But Vice President Bush also, did he have a lot of influence or input with, the soon-to-be President Reagan and during the, the administration? And any nuggets from that would be interesting to know.
You mean the speech on the release of the hostages?
Yeah.
The CIA had no input on that.
No input. Okay, yeah, they were, okay. That's interesting to know.
More broadly, what was the relationship that you observed between President Reagan and Vice President Bush? There
was a good relationship between the two of them, but President Bush's role was not, the Vice President's role is not to make policy, But President Bush had an enormous background. You know, he was former CIA director, former head of the Republican GOP.
Former ambassador to China.
Former ambassador to China and former congressman. So he had an enormous background of his own. And when the assassination attempt took place, I think the country was knew that they were in good hands in case anything happened. So, and he was a gentleman at all times. I had great personal respect for him.
The book is a feast with rigorously researched and riveting prose, and then there's all the materials in the back. Ken is actually going to stick around and sign some books, but please join me in thanking him for spending some time here.
Signed copies of Behind Closed Doors can be purchased through the Reagan Library Museum Store. Every purchase you make from our catalog, website, or museum store is a critical component to our success. In short, your purchase supports our efforts to extend the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. Purchases can be made at reaganlibrary.com/store. To find a listing of all upcoming events, please visit reaganfoundation.org/events. Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless you.
Don't forget to subscribe to A Reagan Forum podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores, and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of A Reagan Forum come out every Thursday. Like what you hear? Check out our Words to Live By podcast, featuring radio addresses and speeches Ronald Reagan delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And don't forget to follow @RonaldReagan on Facebook, @RonaldReagan on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.